Hello, everyone. Today we are talking about, well, this is number 3 in our series on spring foraging. And for our spring foraging challenge, if you're just joining us for the first time, you will find all the other videos in the video section of the Facebook group. You'll also find it in the guides on the Facebook group, and we have also put it inside the membership, so you can find it under the Spring Foraging Challenge inside the membership. So you can, you'll be able to look at all the videos even after the challenge is over if you want to. I'm Chris, and I am the founder of the DIY Herbal Fellowship and the DIY Herb of the Month Club. And today we're going to talk about foraging for edible spring greens. Tomorrow we're going to talk about foraging for medicinal spring greens. And as you know, when we're talking about wild food and wild medicine, there is some crossover because wild greens are probably the most nutritious greens we have access to. Wild greens are even more nutritious than spinach and other leafy greens like kale. These wild plants are generally perennials, and they have, in the fall, they store in their roots all of the nutrients that they need to put on quick growth in the spring. And that quick growth in the spring is full of rich nutrients, minerals, vitamins, as well as antioxidants and polyphenols and flavonoids. And we really need those after we've had a long winter, probably with not our usual 10 to 12 servings of vegetables a day. So spring greens are a great way to really jumpstart our bodies, to get our organs of elimination going, and to detox from the winter sluggishness. And so traditionally, humans have harvested these spring greens for millennia. I have read stories recently of people whose grandparents would go out driving in the countryside in Europe, and when they saw a patch of dandelions, would stop and get out of the car and dig up the dandelions, roots and all, to take home so that they could process a large amount of spring greens, especially dandelions, but also stinging nettles and others. So today we're going to talk about how to go about foraging edible spring greens, which edible spring greens you should be looking for at this time of year. And as always, we want to make sure that you're doing it safely. And so if you're new to foraging, yesterday I talked about field guides. Make sure you do have a field guide to double check. If you're an old hat, then you probably already know most of the spring greens around you. But if you're brand new to foraging, you definitely want to use your field guide. And also if you have a friend or a neighbor who is familiar with these spring greens, it doesn't hurt to just double check when you make a brand new identification that you are correct. Even experienced foragers sometimes make a mistake when it's something brand new. And so there's no shame in asking an expert or someone familiar with the area, is this stinging nettle, or is this wood nettle, or is this garlic mustard, for instance. So let's get started talking about spring greens. Now, the one that is ubiquitous in my neighborhood right now, in my yard, in my pasture, and in my garden is dandelion. And you probably have dandelion growing around you too. If you're out foraging away from your own land, make sure that you're foraging safely. And that means that you're foraging in an area that hasn't been sprayed with pesticides. You want to make sure that the area has not, that is far enough away from the road that you're not going to get road splash in the soil, because plants like dandelions with their long taproot will pull up anything that's been splashed onto the soil, and you don't want to consume those. So the general rule is 50 feet from a major highway or 25 feet from the side of a road. So if what you're wanting to harvest is within that 25 feet, leave it alone. It will tell you though where those plants are naturally, and you can go a little bit further away from the road and you'll probably find the same plants. The other thing is, if you're harvesting somewhere where it's private property, make sure you have the permission of the landowner to harvest. Otherwise, you could be charged with trespassing. And also the other thing is to make sure that anything that you're harvesting isn't protected, and that it's legal to harvest it where you want to harvest it. So we don't harvest, for instance, in a national park. We wouldn't harvest probably in a provincial or state park because that's protected land. And then there are some spring greens that are protected or endangered, and you want to make sure that you're not harvesting illegally. So, and every area is different. You're going to want to check your own area. For instance, in Ontario, it's illegal to harvest a trillium. So you just want to make sure that, and in BC, it's not. So you just want to make sure that where you are, it's legal to harvest what you want to harvest. Okay, let's talk about the spring greens. Now, the number one is dandelion, of course. You may have heard that you shouldn't harvest dandelion flowers because the bees need them. Well, that's not really true, because the more flowers of dandelion that you harvest, the more the plant will send up flowers. First of all, make a correct identification that it is a dandelion. A dandelion will form a rosette of leaves, and then the flowers all come from the center of that rosette, and each flower will have a single stalk. If what you're seeing, the leaves look like dandelion leaves, but the flowers are coming up and you'll have one stalk with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 flowers, that's not a dandelion. Dandelions always have a single stalk with a single flower coming up from the center of the rosette. Also, dandelion leaves are not hairy. So if the plant you're looking at is a little bit hairy, it's probably still edible, but it's not a dandelion. It could be fuzzy pussy, fuzzy cat's paws, or some of those other plants that look like dandelion but aren't dandelion. Now, the good news is there are some lookalikes of dandelion that aren't dandelion, but none of them are poisonous. So we're pretty safe. If it looks like a dandelion, you're okay. But it's only a dandelion if it has a single stalk with one flower. If the stalk branches, then it's not a dandelion. Now, dandelions are a little bit bitter once the flowers form. So if you get a rosette and it has lots of green leaves and the flowers are just little buttons in the center, that's not going to be very bitter, and that's going to be choice for using the leaves raw. It's also great for making into pesto because the bitterness they're fairly mild. And then as it goes into the season and the flowers start to form, the energy moves from the leaves and moves into the flower. And at that point, the most nutritious, medicinal, best part of the dandelion is going to be that flower. And it's not very bitter. It's surprisingly, for most, if it's getting adequate water, the dandelion flower will not be very bitter. Some people, we're going to talk more about dandelion flowers medicinally tomorrow when we talk about harvesting spring greens for medicine. But you can use those flowers raw in salad. You can batter them and fry them like fritters. If you do decide to dry the dandelion flowers, there are a few special techniques to use so that you don't end up with just a pile of white fluff. And we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. Another plant that is ready to harvest in my yard right now is stinging nettle. In my yard, they're only about this high now. I've been waiting. I've had one harvest so far. I usually try to get them when they're between 4 and 7 inches tall. And then I just go with scissors with gloves on because they will sting. They're not as bad at this stage, but I still don't like getting scratched by them. And you can just clip them off and take them home. And what I do is I put on gloves and I put a sink of water and I just swish them through the water to get any dirt off. And then I put them all in a pot and bring them to a boil, take them off, and then plunge them into cold water to blanch them. And then after that, you can use them as is. You can dry them. You can serve them like asparagus, or you can cut them up and serve them like spinach. And when I have a lot of them, I will even at that stage put them in a freezer bag and put them in the freezer for the winter. You can also at that stage dry them. And I shared in the free group, I shared a recipe this morning where the person had taken them, blanched them, and then dried them in a dehydrator and then powdered them and then used them as a nettle powder throughout the winter like you would a green supplement. So that's another idea. Another spring green is ramps, wild onions, wild leeks. There's different kinds in different areas. And these ones, I want you to be cautious when you're harvesting. Ramps are on the endangered list. And so if you see a patch of wild ramps, I don't want you to pull them up by the roots, really. They take a long time. I think it's 5 years before they're ready to harvest the first time. And so if you pull that plant up by the roots, it's not going to replace itself. So the best thing to do with ramps is to go out with scissors and cut off the tops and just take the tops home and leave the root in the ground to regrow and to form seed, or get some ramp seed from a medicinal seed or herbal seed store, or online market. Like I found them on Richter's, and plant them in your own garden, and leave the wild plot to regrow, reproduce, so that our next generation will have wild ramps. There are also wild leeks, and they're called, and there's wild garlic. And so again, know what the pressure is on the wild populations when you harvest them. If you pull it out by the roots, it's not going to regrow. If you cut off the top for use, you can still benefit from that and have the flavor while you leave the plant to reproduce. Chickweed. Chickweed is another one that is, it's really great. If you get it young before it flowers, you can use it in salads. You can cook it and use it just like you would spinach. It's also a medicinal plant, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But as far as using it as a green, you can harvest it stalk and all. If it hasn't yet formed the flowers, then it's tender and it won't be very fibrous in the stalk. So you can use it fresh. A few others would be sourdock, lamb's quarters, and the red dock. All of those can be used the same way. They can be used as fresh greens. They can be used like spinach, and they're all things like strawberry spinach. We have all of those growing around us. And basically, I want you to use your field guide, make a for sure identification, and then go ahead and use them once you know for sure what you have. So lamb's quarters, dock, those are from the same family as spinach. And so they do taste a lot like spinach. One thing I need to warn you about, if you're going to eat a lot of them, they're very high in oxalic acid, which generally speaking is not a problem. But if you're eating a lot of it at one time, it does bind with calcium in your gut and prevents your body from absorbing calcium from your food. So just keep that in mind if you're taking calcium supplements, or if you are taking other things with calcium in them, that eating a lot of greens with oxalic acid in it can bind that and prevent it from working properly in your body. Now, what parts of the plant are we using? Well, with dandelions, we're going to use the leaves, we're going to use the flowers. We could also at this time use the root and make dandelion coffee, or you could use the root medicinally if you wanted to do that. With ramps, you're using the green tops. In most cases with these, you're using the green tops. And if they're flowering, you can use the flowers as well. But it's mostly the green tops. With spring greens, they're very tonic. They're high in minerals and vitamins. And so for that reason, it's the green part we're using. And then one other one before we go that I wanted to mention is a few flowers that are available in early spring. One is rose. Roses might bloom anytime from the end of this month to the end of next month. And the petals are very nutritious. The same vitamin C that's in rose hips are also in rose petals. I like to infuse them in things like vinegar or honey, and then use them throughout the year. And then violet flowers are also very fun. One of the things you can do is use them in a bread dough or a cookie dough and get the flavor, that floral flavor in your food. You can also crystallize them with sugar and make candied violets or candied rose petals, and that's another fun thing to do. Now, in that case, you're using them more for the color and for the texture and a little bit for flavor. They don't have as high in nutrition just because you're not going to eat a lot of them. It's more for a garnish and to be beautiful, which is important too in food preservation. So we've talked about kind of the rules around gathering spring greens, that you should have permission of the landowner, that you should harvest away from highways, away from roads, and that you should make sure the land has not been sprayed. And also that you should be aware of the endangered status of whatever you plan to harvest. You should have your field guide so that you know for sure and can make a positive identification. And then we've talked about the plants that are available right now in season that you can be harvesting as you see them. I highly encourage you, as you're harvesting, or say as you're weeding your garden, that you harvest those things for food rather than just throwing them in a compost pile. And there are things like dandelion greens, dandelion flowers, nettles, onions, ramps, chickweed, violets, garlic mustard, lamb's quarters, and we're basically using the green part, the above ground part, and the flowers. And if you have any questions, okay, Sarah's asking where to get the ramp seed from. I have found them this year at Richter's Seed, which is in Ontario. They sell internationally. And I think there's also medicinal seed. What is it called? Traditional medicinal seed. I think they also had it. I don't know if they still have it. But I can get the link for you and share it in the group. Are there any other questions? Okay, funny story. I was talking about dandelions with one of our staff, a gal on our team, and she actually asked me to dig up a dandelion from my garden and bring it to her so that she could plant it in her yard because she had no dandelions. So if you don't have some of these growing around you, like nettles or dandelions, you might have a neighbor that has some and would be willing to dig them up from their yard and pass them on to you. So it doesn't hurt to ask, to let people know you're looking for it. I would suggest, if it's something like stinging nettles, that you don't put it right in your garden, but that you put it on a side yard, maybe between your house and the alleyway, rather than having it in your garden, because it does grow by runners, and you don't really want to be weeding your garden and getting stung by a nettle. I have to admit, I don't always wear gloves when I am weeding. And sometimes I'll just be walking through harvesting and I'll see a weed and I'll reach down and pluck it. And sometimes that weed is a nettle. Now, nettles, if they're growing and they're young, they look a lot like catnip in the garden. So you might not know it's nettle, and you might think you're pulling out a catnip and then get stung, or vice versa. You might think it's a nettle and then you touch it and you find out, oh, it doesn't sting. Then it's a catnip. Catnip and nettle, they don't smell the same, but they look a lot the same. And I definitely recommend, oh, and the other thing about nettle that's really confusing is that nettle actually looks as if it's a mint family plant. Now, catnip is a mint family plant, but nettle looks like it's a mint family plant because it has a square stem, it has opposite leaves, and it even makes that mint family pattern when you look down from the top. But nettle is not a mint family plant. It's actually in a category by itself, and you know that when you see a nettle forming seed because it doesn't look like a mint family flower. But in the spring, it's hard to tell them apart. So just know nettle is not a mint family plant, and if you touch it, you will get stung. And it just, if you do get stung, then there should be plantain or jewelweed or dandelion growing somewhere nearby. And any of those plants, if you rub a leaf on the nettle sting will go away. I generally try to get plantain, but also dock leaves will also work. So if you do get stung and you start to get that little blister from the sting, just know you can just rub it with a leaf from dandelion, plantain, jewelweed, dock, and the sting will go away. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about harvesting medicinal spring weeds, plants. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about violets and the mucilage from violets. I'm going to be talking a little bit about using chickweed as a medicinal, and also we're going to be talking about using dandelions as a medicinal, particularly the roots, how to make dandelion coffee, but also how to use dandelion root as a tea, and how to make sure that, and a few other things like willow bark and black cherry bark. We'll be talking about that tomorrow. So I'll see you tomorrow, same time at 2 o'clock, and thanks for joining me.